When it comes to Kenya, the political uncertainty still remains. Even though Uhuru Kenyatta was sworn in for his second term in front of cheering crowds, opposition rival Odinga says that he will be inaugurated on December 12. The election boycotted by opposition has led to a political divide in Kenya. This edition of the debate, we will look at whether months of Odinga's acrimonious campaigns are preventing Kenya's growth and compare it to the support that Kenyatta has.
Tens of thousands of Kenyans gathered at a stadium in the capital Nairobi on Tuesday to see President Uhuru Kenyatta take the oath of his second term in office.
I, Uhuru Kenyatta,
do swear
that I will always
truly and diligently serve the people and the Republic of Kenya
without fear,
favor, affection, or ill will. So help me God.
So help me God.
Not very far from the venue, security forces engaged in street battles with supporters of opposition leader Raila Odinga. Odinga, who had attended a rally to honor those killed in the country's recent unrest, claims he is Kenya's president-elect.
This election of October 26 is fake. We do not recognize. We have said it. This coming month, on December 12, we will have an assembly that will swear me in.
Several protesters, including a child, were killed or injured in the clashes. Police used tear gas and fired gunshot to disperse the crowd.
I'm here for my right, and I don't know why are these people. Why won't you have our right here? They're bullshitting us about tear gas. Are we the animals in the forest?
Nairobi has been the scene of protests following the victory of Uhuru Kenyatta in the August presidential election. As the opposition was crying foul and fraud, the Supreme Court nullified the results over irregularities. The repeat election was held in late October. In the absence of Odinga, who had boycotted the vote, Kenyatta scored a 98% victory. After the inauguration ceremony, Uhuru Kenyatta, who is the son of Kenya's founding father, Jomo Kenyatta, pledged to raise the standard of living, create jobs, and provide millions of Kenyans with health insurance. But it's not clear if these promises would appease Odinga's supporters, who accused the ruling party of neglecting vast parts of the country, overseeing corruption and right abuses by security forces. The post-election violence has so far left more than 70 victims. With Kenyatta urging people to free themselves from past grievances, only one thing is for sure. The unrest has further split the country that's already divided on ethnic and communal lines.
Our guest joining us for this edition of the debate, founder and publisher of AfricaBriefing.org, Jonathan Ofin-Ansah, joins us from London, and African policy analyst Lawrence Freeman joins us from Washington, D.C. I'd like to welcome you both. And Lawrence Freeman, let me start with you. To begin with, Kenyan opposition leader Raila Odinga. He has said that he will be sworn in as president on December 12th. And this came only hours after Uhuru Kenyatta was inaugurated. What are we missing here? What is it that he knows that perhaps we don't know?
The decision by Mr. Odinga to have a separate swearing-in ceremony on December 12th is really not valid. He was not elected by the people of Kenya. Kenyatta was elected. It was a problem with the election. And this goes back over a century, because when the British colonized Kenya, they nurtured the ethnic differences and rather than transcending them. So you have Kenyatta is followed by one group, which is mainly the Kikuyu, and then Odinga is followed by another group, the Luo and the Kalenjin. But right now, people are going to suffer, because if you don't have the support of the country behind one president, then you're not going to have the appropriate policies. And I think that Odinga, despite his disagreements, is doing a disservice, because he's not helping Kenya if he's going to form a resistance movement, avoid discussions, and then carry on his own ceremony, which has really no valid legal validity to it.
Well, Jonathan Ofin-Ansah, how united of a support does Uhuru Kenyatta have compared to what Odinga has? Let's maybe perhaps set the stage there to see what you think the support base of each is in terms of a percentage, if you can.
Yeah, the support, for the two men, Kenyatta and Odinga, are almost equally divided along tribal lines. And Kenyatta, being a Kikuyu, which is the biggest tribe in Kenya, ostensibly enjoys more support than Odinga. But having said that, I would say that most of Odinga supporters are rural and the mass unemployed who feel neglected, by the Kenyatta government.
Lawrence Freeman, you talked about the resistance group that you have it being formed. If you can elaborate on that, by Odinga. What is it exactly that Odinga's game plan is at this point? He has said that there isn't enough representation when it comes to the tribal groups based on the way that the setup is in the country. Is this resistance group comprised of some of these tribal groups? What is that all about?
Odinga has declared several weeks ago that he was going to establish a resistance movement. Now, I don't think anybody knows exactly what that means. Now he's announced today that he's going to have his own swearing-in ceremony on December 12th. Well, he can't have his own swearing ceremony, and he didn't win the election. He chose not to run in the last election. So what you're going to have now, as the previous speaker mentioned, is you have the country divided along ethnicity, which is a real problem in Africa. I work all over the continent. And rather than having one strong nation state with a central government that everybody supports, you have fragmented support throughout the country. So this means that even though Kenyatta won the election, because the Odinga forces refused to participate in the re-election in October 26th, the previous speaker is correct. He's not going to have full support. So this can be used. Odinga can be used and manipulated by outside forces to continue to weaken the country. The big problem in Kenya, as it is with most countries in the Horn of Africa, West Africa, South Africa, is they need massive economic development in infrastructure, in energy, in water, rail. There is improvement in this area in Kenya. They just completed the first leg of the Mombasa-Nairobi rail with the Chinese, and they want to expand it. But they need a lot more to be done in energy and transportation, and they have to provide jobs for people. And this is going to obviously be weakened if you have a whole section of the country that is declaring itself in opposition to the president, which is what Odinga has said.
What is the opposition to the president, Jonathan Ofei-Ansah, when it comes to what people are not feeling by his tenure so far? There have been reports of corruption. That's pretty evident. It's out in the open. Also, many Kenyans are saying that, why is it that he has come out saying that, yes, there is corruption, but, famous speech, his hands are tied, which angered many Kenyans. Aside from corruption, if you can expand on that more, how deeply is that affecting the country and his administration, and also any other areas that people are opposed and or have grievances against the government?
Well, the major grievance, the people have, is, like you mentioned, is corruption. There's perceived corruption, especially official corruption, all over the place. Even the Auditor General has come out, documented, so many incidences of corruption within officialdom and elsewhere in the country. But like you pointed out, the president said, Kenyatta said, he would like to tackle it, but his hands are tied. I mean, if you are the president and your hands are tied, what are you talking about? Because you have the power, you have been mandated to rule the country, you've been mandated to make sure that the processes, the structures of government run smooth. You have been mandated to ensure that corruption is, if not completely eliminated, is minimized. So when you say your hands are tied, I mean, it leaves a sour taste, in the people's mouths.
Lawrence Freeman, interesting statement that Odinga has made, not very recent, but he talked about Western diplomats and he criticized them. And he said that Western diplomats, including the United States, are very irresponsible in an election, even though it wasn't going to be credible, as he said. Now, first of all, were Western diplomats, like the ones from the U.S., were they pressing for the election? And why do you think he has leveled this accusation against the West, in particular the U.S.?
The election that took place in August, you had international observers, including former Secretary of State John Kerry was there, and they all approved and said the election was free and fair. And then irregularities and illegalities were brought up, and the Supreme Court overturned the decision of the election, which all the international observers, United States, Europe, and Africa, all had commended as an appropriately fair election. So when this occurred, the appropriate policy is you have to schedule a re-election, which was then scheduled for October 26th. And that's part of the constitutional process. There are so many days that you have to schedule a new election. There's no option on that. My understanding is Odinga didn't like the fact that certain changes weren't made, had disputes with the Electoral Commission, and therefore boycotted the election. Well, once you boycott the election, which you may do for symbolic political purposes, but then you cannot attack the election that you boycotted. So Odinga has tied himself into a bad corner right now. My fear is that Odinga will be used. So look, there are certain political, financial forces around Africa that go back to the British colonial days who want to weaken countries, to want to weaken the institutions of countries. And now that Odinga has declared his resistance to this government, and I read one quote where he says there's no room for dialogue or discussion with Kenyatta and his ruling party, well then what are you left with? You're going to try to disrupt the country. And the reason I mentioned in the beginning the history of colonialism is these ethnic groups fight each other because they want to be in power, because they believe only by being in power can they get the material wealth and a bigger slice of the economic pie for their grouping. My approach is to expand economic growth so everybody can be taken care of. This is why I support the building of railroads, which the Chinese involved, hydroelectric dams, roads, water projects, so that we must raise the standard of living of all Africans, eliminate poverty, eliminate this high mortality rate, and give people a future. And everybody in the country has to be included in that. And if Kenyatta is far-sighted, he must develop programs and policies that include all the people of the country, not just the people of his party or his ethnicity. And if he doesn't do that, and Odinga continues to resist, then dangers could develop.
Very well. We're going to expand on that a little bit more. But first, let's take a quick time out, listen to some of the viewer comments. We'll get right back to the debate.
He is good at creating circus, and he's too old and could be suffering from Alzheimer. Otherwise, we're fine here in Nairobi. Kenya has reached unprecedented levels of madness now. Who has heard of 2 presidents being sworn in a single country? He is just dreaming something that can't happen. We are used to him. He has been a nuisance ever since he joined politics. In 1982, he attempted but failed to overthrow the government of the then President Moi. Here in Nairobi, we are fine. He will soon realize he has an impossible mission. Soon and very soon, life will be back to normalcy after almost 10 months of campaigning and electioneering process. This man is a troublemaker. I wish you were a Nigerian and lived in Nigeria when Sani Abacha was alive. You're not even interested in the number of people your actions have sent to early graves. Why don't you give up or wait till another election? African leaders should call this man now to order to avert another crisis in Kenya that may result to war.
Okay, some of the viewer comments there. Jonathan, let's look at what Lawrence Freeman has said, and even yourself. You guys both have agreed on the fact that it's somewhat split down the middle, somewhat, when it comes to the support of each of these personalities. Of course, the president and Odinga. However, Odinga's statements are proven and are pointing to the direction that he is going to continue with his campaign of resistance and trying to pretty much push back against Kenyatta. One particular one is very telling. On November the 7th, he said that he wants an interim government to run the country for 6 months while the Constitution is reviewed to curb the president's authority. Are we looking at a prolonged conflict here if we have Odinga with that frame of mind resisting against what has occurred now, which was the swearing in, and of course Kenyatta trying to govern Kenya?
Yes, we had a similar scenario a few years ago when there was a stalemate in elections after the violence that erupted, and an interim, a unity government was set up with Odinga being the prime minister, and I think Kabir, I forgot the guy's name, being the president. Okay, so I think Odinga was expecting Kibaki, thank you very much, Kibaki being the president, yes. So Odinga was expecting, might have expected something like this. But you see, stepping up any resistance movement or that kind of thing wouldn't help anybody in Kenya. Look, Kenya is the biggest economy in the region. Right now, the acrimonious campaign, and the violence and all that, is blunting Kenya's economic growth. And if Kenya's economic performance and growth are affected, the whole region, East Africa region, is also affected. So the best line of action, I believe, Odinga should take is to just reach out to Kenyatta and enter into dialogue, right, and map the best way forward. But try to form some sort of a resistance movement. The place is already volatile, okay, and this movement resistance could escalate, into more violence, even maybe worse than we saw a few years ago.
Well, Lawrence Freeman, going along this line, let's look at, again, the support here. And in particular now, I'd like to ask you about the support from the tribes. Basically, Odinga's supporters, from what we understand, they've largely drawn from other ethnic groups, which are large in numbers, and they feel that they're excluded from power. Are the numbers large enough for it to pose a potential problem, not a potential, but to pose a problem, or to continue posing a problem for Kenyatta, in which Odinga says that, 3 of Kenya's presidents since independence from Britain back in '63 were from the Kikuyu ethnic group, and one was from the Kalenjin group, of course meaning that there wasn't enough representation.
Yes, this is a serious problem. I was discussing this with some people today in Washington, that Kenyatta can have a rough 5 years ahead of him. The violence in 2007, 2008 was up to 1,400 people. I think about 6 people have been killed so far. It's a much lower level. But see, what happens if you put people into poverty and people are desperate and they can't survive and they can't feed their children, then they will do desperate things. And they believe that the only way they can ascertain the material wealth to keep their families and their children alive is they have to have their group be in power. And that's the problem. We haven't developed a nation state in Africa at the level we should have. The nation state should represent all the interests of the country. We don't have that in Kenya, we don't have that in Nigeria, we don't have that in other countries. And that's the problem. The colonialism and slavery denied the Africans the right to have a nation that represented everyone. So the situation in Kenya today is that a large group of people made up of at least 2 major tribes, the Kalenjin and the Luo, are going to resist under Odinga. He has no legal basis for getting sworn in on December 12th, but he will be used as a tool, whether he knows it or not, to continue weakening the government. And as my colleague said, Kenya has to move forward. Ethiopia now may have overtaken Kenya as the #1 economy in East Africa. They're very close. But for Kenya to build up its economy, to continue to work with the Chinese on the new Silk Road, to bring people jobs and economic growth, he needs to have the backing of people. And Odinga could spoil that. Odinga could bring more war. Odinga could bring more killing. And this would be very sad indeed for Kenya and for Africa if that were to happen.
Unfortunately, we have to end it there. Thank you very much. Let me thank our guest, founder and publisher of AfricaBriefing.org, Jonathan Ofei-Ansah from London, and African policy analyst Lawrence Freeman. Thank you for your comments from Washington, D.C. Thanks for tuning in to another edition of The Debate. For me, Kavita, the entire team in the Capital Tehran, it's goodbye.